There is a profound difference between solitude that is imposed and solitude that is chosen. Conscious celibacy belongs to the latter. It is not a withdrawal born from rejection, nor is it a punishment of the self. It is a deliberate pause, a decision to let the body rest so that the soul can be heard. In a world where intimacy is often equated with validation, such a choice can feel radical. Yet for many mature women, this path becomes a portal, not to emptiness, but to clarity. Carl Jung believed that when the impulses of daily life are quieted, the unconscious begins to speak with greater force. Normally, the rhythms of desire, the need for attention, and the constant push to be chosen drown out this inner voice. But in the stillness of celibacy, a different current emerges. By stepping away from the noise of pursuit and performance, a woman gives space to her own depths. What at first feels like silence becomes a conversation with herself, one that reveals truths long hidden beneath the surface. The body, too, finds renewal in this choice. Constant availability, whether physical or emotional, can leave the body feeling depleted. When a woman decides to rest from that cycle, she discovers a new relationship with her own energy. Her rest is not merely physical, it is spiritual. It is the kind of rest that rebuilds her strength from within. Jung often spoke of the psyche's need for balance, and celibacy can be seen as a balancing act, a conscious retreat from outer demands in order to reconnect with inner life. There are symbolic images that capture this journey. Imagine a woman walking through a quiet forest, no one's footsteps beside her, no hand guiding her path. At first, she feels the weight of absence, but then she notices the sound of her own breath, the rhythm of her own steps. What once seemed like loneliness becomes presence. Or think of a woman sitting at her own table, drinking tea without the distraction of conversation. The silence, instead of pressing down on her, begins to lift her. She hears herself more clearly than she has in years. These moments are not about lack, they are about discovery. Women who have embraced conscious celibacy often describe it not as deprivation, but as expansion. One shared that after decades of equating touch with worth, she finally allowed herself to stop, and in that pause, she discovered the joy of writing again. Another, after years of defining her value by how much she was pursued, chose celibacy and began to feel a new kind of freedom, the freedom of being enough without being desired. Their clarity did not come from being chosen by someone else, but from choosing themselves. The truth is that conscious celibacy is not about closing doors. It is about opening different ones, doors to the inner life, to creativity, to intuition, to peace. It is a refusal to let the body's hunger dictate the soul's direction. It is a reorientation that says, I am more than my availability. And in that statement lies a kind of liberation that cannot be given from the outside. It must be claimed within. In this way, the silence of the body becomes a portal for the soul. It is not a void, but a sanctuary. It is not about turning away from life, but about turning more deeply toward it. For the mature woman, it becomes a season of clarity, where the rest of the body allows the soul to finally speak in its fullest voice. For centuries, women have been measured by how much they are desired. Magazines, films, family traditions, all have sent the message that a woman's worth shines brightest when it is reflected in a man's gaze. Many internalize the idea that to feel alive is to be pursued, wanted, claimed. The absence of that attention can feel like invisibility, as though life itself were dimmed. But conscious celibacy interrupts this conditioning. It says, my vitality does not depend on being desired. It declares that a woman is not reduced to how many eyes follow her, but is defined by the strength of the gaze she directs toward herself. The psychological impact of choosing not to be defined by desire is immense. Suddenly, she no longer asks, do they find me attractive? But instead, do I feel aligned with who I am? The subtle anxiety of waiting for external confirmation begins to dissolve. Where there was once a restless search for validation, there is now space to breathe. Carl Jung would explain this as a withdrawal of projection. Instead of placing identity in the approval of others, the woman calls her projections back, reclaiming the parts of herself she once gave away. The result is liberation. She is whole, regardless of who notices. This shift also challenges men and society at large. When a woman chooses not to participate in the constant exchange of availability and validation, some interpret it as defiance. They may label her cold or unapproachable, but in truth, she is simply free. By no longer hinging her sense of self on being wanted, she places the focus back where it belongs, on the authenticity of her own desires, her own rhythms, her own soul. The liberation is not about rejecting sexuality. It is about refusing to let it define the entire measure of worth. When the gaze of men is no longer the mirror, the woman discovers she has always had her own. She sees herself differently, not as a body to be chosen, but as a presence to be honored. This recognition changes everything, from how she walks into a room to how she holds silence. Desire from others becomes optional, not essential. Jung's archetype of the priestess captures this truth. The priestess is not admired for her availability, but for her aura of depth and mystery. She does not strive to be desired. She embodies a sacred quiet that carries its own power. Her value lies not in performance, but in presence. Women who step into conscious celibacy often awaken this archetype within themselves. They discover that the absence of constant pursuit does not diminish them, it strengthens them. Their quietude becomes magnetic precisely because it is rooted in self-sufficiency. Everyday life offers examples of this quiet power. A woman who once dressed to be noticed now dresses to feel aligned with herself. Another who once filled silences with nervous chatter now allows pauses to linger, unafraid of what others think. One who once feared going to a cafe alone now finds joy in the solitude of her own company. These are not acts of rejection, but of reclamation. They are ways of saying, I exist beyond the demand to please, beyond the need to be chosen. The paradox is that when a woman no longer seeks validation through desire, her presence often becomes more striking. She radiates not because she is trying to be seen, but because she no longer needs to be. This freedom shifts the energy around her, filtering out those who crave compliance and drawing closer those who respect autonomy. In this way, conscious celibacy becomes not a withdrawal from life, but an invitation to deeper, truer connections. The truth is simple. The liberation that comes from realizing your value does not depend on your availability is the beginning of a new kind of power. It is the power of knowing that you are enough, even in silence, even unseen. It is the power of walking through the world not as an object of desire, but as a subject of your own story. Celibacy, chosen with awareness, is not a denial of life, but a season of individuation, a step Jung described as the process of becoming whole. Unlike abstinence imposed by circumstance or deprivation, conscious celibacy is a decision to pause, to redirect attention from the outer world to the inner one. For a woman who has spent years entangled in relationships, whether fulfilling or draining, this pause can feel like an exhale after a long performance. It is not a retreat from love, but a clearing of space where she can finally ask, who am I when I am not defined by another's gaze or needs? This period becomes a sacred ground for revisiting old emotional patterns. Without the constant influx of romantic dynamics, flirtations, disappointments, negotiations, or validations, there is space to reflect on what has repeated across her history. She may see clearly for the first time how often she confused attention with affection or stability with love. She may recognize how she tolerated behaviors that eroded her peace simply because she feared solitude. In the stillness of celibacy, These realizations rise to the surface not as accusations, but as truths waiting to be acknowledged. And with acknowledgement comes the possibility of change. Jung emphasized that individuation requires confronting the unconscious patterns we carry. In the context of celibacy, this means facing the old beliefs that once governed attraction. I am valuable only when desired, or I must sacrifice to be chosen. When no partner is present to reinforce these beliefs, they are exposed for what they are: stories learned, not truths lived. The absence of constant interaction gives her the distance needed to separate conditioning from essence. She begins to see that she is not losing anything by resting from the emotional game. Rather, she is gaining the space to rewrite her narrative. This pause also creates room for desires that are truly her own, not shaped by cultural scripts or romantic expectations. What does she long for when no one is watching? What sparks joy when the pressure to please is removed? Perhaps it is the rediscovery of creative expression, painting, writing, or dancing in ways she once abandoned. Perhaps it is the freedom to travel alone, to explore places without compromise. Or perhaps it is as simple as cultivating daily rituals that honor her rhythm: a quiet breakfast, a walk at sunset, evenings spent in reflection. These desires, small or large, carry a different quality than those shaped by the need to attract or keep another. They come from within, not from the demand to perform. The power of this phase lies in the realization that nothing essential is lost by stepping away from constant relational pursuit. On the contrary, what is lost are only illusions: the belief that life without romance is emptiness, that pleasure must always be tied to intimacy, that validation must come from being chosen. By setting aside these illusions, she creates space for something deeper: the recognition that her soul has its own rhythm, one that can only be heard in stillness. Jung would call this returning to the self, the center that unites all aspects of the psyche. Stories of women who embraced this path illustrate its richness. One, after decades of long relationships, chose 2 years of celibacy to focus on healing and study. She emerged not only with academic success, but with a profound sense of freedom she had never felt before. Another, widowed and pressured to remarry quickly, resisted and discovered that solitude gave her the courage to start a community project that had been her dream for years. Their stories show that the pause of celibacy is not empty time, but fertile ground. This season does not have to last forever, but while it lasts, it reshapes her relationship with herself. It teaches that her worth is not suspended in waiting for another, but rooted in her own being. It proves that rest is not the enemy of love, but its preparation. By becoming whole in solitude, she ensures that any love that comes next will meet her in fullness, not in lack. The truth of conscious celibacy as individuation is this: it is not an ending, but a beginning. It is the choice to step off the stage of constant validation and step into the sanctuary of the soul. And in that sanctuary, she finds not loneliness, but wholeness, not silence, but clarity, not absence, but presence. When the body rests from the constant pull of physical availability, something remarkable begins to stir. Creative energy that had been quietly suppressed returns with force. Jung described this as sublimation, the redirection of instinctual drives into higher expressions of the psyche. In conscious celibacy, what might have been consumed in pursuit of validation or intimacy is now released into projects, passions, and self-discovery. Instead of dispersing energy outward to sustain attraction, the woman redirects it inward, and from that inner fire, creation takes root. This transformation often begins subtly. A woman who once measured her evenings by whether a partner called now finds herself writing, painting, or studying with renewed vigor. Another who once defined her weekends by companionship starts devoting them to gardening, volunteering, or traveling solo. Freed from the weight of maintaining availability, the energy once bound to relational tension finds new channels. These pursuits are not distractions from celibacy, they are its fruits. The absence of sexual competition or expectation clears mental and emotional space for deeper pursuits that might have long been neglected. Jung's framework of the psyche suggests that instinct and creativity share a common source. Libido, in his terms, is not just sexual energy, it is life energy. When not consumed by external demand, it can be harnessed for transformation. Women who embrace conscious celibacy often describe bursts of productivity and inspiration, as though a dormant spring has been tapped. Passions they abandoned years ago, writing poetry, learning a new language, or playing music, suddenly resurface. It is as if the silence of the body opens the ear of the soul, and in that listening, forgotten desires awaken. History and literature hold countless stories of this kind of transformation. Monastic traditions across cultures spoke of celibacy not as repression, but as a way of channeling energy into devotion and art. Modern women echo this truth in personal accounts. One shared that after years of defining herself through relationships, her chosen celibacy allowed her to complete a novel she had dreamed of writing. Another discovered that her creative photography, long left aside, flourished when she no longer measured her evenings by another's availability. These are not tales of deprivation, but of reclamation. The psychological impact is liberating. Creative expression becomes not only a pastime, but a mirror. It reflects back to the woman her autonomy, her depth, her vitality. Instead of waiting for intimacy to affirm her aliveness, she experiences aliveness in the act of creating, in the joy of producing something that belongs only to her. This independence does not deny the value of future relationships. It simply ensures she will never again confuse being desired with being alive. Moreover, this redirection of energy strengthens identity. Jung would say that sublimation refines instinct into consciousness. The woman begins to see herself not as someone who must always be available, but as someone whose energy has sacred value. She learns to invest it with intention. Each project completed, each passion reignited, builds a new narrative. I am more than who I am to others. I am who I choose to become. The paradox is that this creative flowering often makes her even more magnetic. A woman absorbed in her passions carries a glow that cannot be faked. Her independence, her productivity, her joy, they attract, not because she seeks attention, but because she radiates authenticity. Those who approach her now must approach her essence, not her availability. And this, perhaps, is the quietest form of empowerment. Conscious celibacy is not the absence of intimacy, it is the presence of creativity. It transforms the energy of longing into the energy of building. It turns rest into renewal, silence into voice, abstinence into abundance. By stepping back from the demands of the body, a woman awakens the power of the soul. And in that awakening, she discovers not only what she can live without, but what she can create because of it. When the body no longer dictates the rhythm of life, the soul begins to speak in its own language. Conscious celibacy opens a space where inner wisdom, long overshadowed by the demands of desire and validation, can finally be heard. In this silence, intuition rises with clarity. The woman discovers that she is not empty without constant intimacy. She is more present, more aware, more attuned to the voice that whispers from within. Jung would call this the moment of individuation, when the self aligns with its deepest truth and no longer hides beneath masks of expectation. The clarity that emerges in this season is unlike any other. Without the pull to be chosen or desired, decisions are guided less by fear and more by authenticity. She begins to recognize which relationships honor her and which only consumed her energy. She notices patterns in her past, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Freed from the constant negotiation of being available, she can finally choose with discernment. This freedom is not coldness, it is love redirected first toward herself. Conscious celibacy also becomes a practice of power. To live without apology for the absence of a partner, to resist the cultural pressure that equates worth with being desired, is an act of profound sovereignty. It proves that she is whole in herself. The body rests, but the soul flourishes. Her value no longer hangs on approval or pursuit. It rests on the undeniable truth of her own essence. This is why women who walk this path often radiate peace. They are not chasing love, they are embodying it. The archetype of the wise woman reflects this stage. She does not measure her significance by youth or desire, but by the depth of her presence. Her voice carries authority not because it is loud, but because it is rooted in lived truth. She has learned that real intimacy begins not with another, but with the self. By listening to her own soul, she gains a strength that no relationship can give and none can take away. Stories of transformation illustrate this. A woman in her 60s described how, after choosing celibacy, she found herself more connected to her intuition than ever before. She began writing daily reflections that guided her choices with uncanny precision. Another, in midlife, realized that stepping away from sexual availability gave her the courage to confront old traumas and heal them. Their journeys remind us that celibacy is not absence, but presence. The presence of clarity, of authenticity, of soul. This does not mean that love or intimacy will never return. It simply means that if they do, they will enter a different space, one where the woman no longer confuses affection with necessity. She welcomes companionship not from need, but from freedom. She knows that what she has found within herself is too precious to sacrifice, and this inner knowledge becomes her greatest protection against relationships that would drain her. The truth is that when the body rests, the soul finally speaks, and what it says is powerful. It says that love begins with self-respect. It says that solitude is not punishment, but sanctuary. It says that freedom is not found in being chosen, but in choosing oneself first. This is the essence of conscious celibacy. Not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning where the woman stands in her sovereignty, hears her own voice, and walks forward carrying the peace that comes when body and soul are finally aligned.